Andrew from Sachs. Welcome to video number 6 in our 10 video sequence about mental health and mental illness and how it relates to psychometric assessment. In this video, we'll be talking about a brand new perspective on mental health and mental illness, very different from the diagnostic and statistical manual perspective that I showed in earlier videos. And I think that this is really exciting because it gives us a new perspective on what mental health is, but also some potential ways of treating it better. So the new way of looking at the question of mental illness is this concept of a P factor, a psychopathology factor, which can be regarded as a kind of a disability. So this arises from research which shows us that a person who has one mental illness is vastly more likely to have other mental illnesses. So for instance, if you are schizophrenic, then you're far more likely to be obsessive compulsive, or you're far more likely to be paranoid, or you're far more likely to have a phobia or something like that. And in fact, the overlap is so significant that it caused people to think, well, is mental health and mental illness in some very significant way interwoven? And the answer appears to be yes. So in a study of 30,000 people, Leahy et al. Found one single factor offered the best explanation for mental health issues across 11 mental health conditions. In science, we call this form of statistical analysis a factor analysis. What are the factors underlying all of this data? And he discovered what we would call a super factor, which is to say there's incredible shared variances across different types of mental illness. So what is actually going on to cause this? And we know that there's a strong genetic component to all of this, as mentioned earlier. So the heritability estimates of this P factor can be as high as 50 to 60%. So if you're unlucky enough to have this P factor, well, you won't necessarily just have one mental illness. You might have a cocktail of mental illnesses that will pop up at different times. And it makes sense to regard this as kind of a generalized disability. Some people are kind of naturally mentally healthy, and other people may have this P factor, which really could be a burden on them over the course of their lives. And this explains a range of things, why mental health patterns within families tend to persist, and also why specific treatments can work for many different conditions. Because if a person has P and a therapy addresses the P factor rather than the specific mental illness, then that could work for a range of different things. Interesting. Now, but the most interesting thing I think about all of this is that we start to move from symptoms to systems. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. People who have this P factor seem to have generalized systemic issues in the way that their brain operates. And so in the study that we're showing you here, Romer et al. And Tak et al. In 2018 and 2021, here are some generalized issues that seem to be associated with P. One is, can the brain talk amongst itself? Now, I must confess, this is not how the researchers put it, it's how I decided to put it, but in effect, if parts of your brain can communicate effectively with other parts of the brain, then your brain is harmonious, if you want to put it that way. Let's look at the question of a phobia. So, I know a person who has a moth phobia. She often will say that it's like she has a lunatic living inside her skull. She uses that word. So, what you're finding is that she knows cognitively that moths are completely harmless, but it doesn't stop her being terrified of them. Isn't that defined by incapacity of one part of the brain to communicate with another? That certainly seems to be an aspect of P. A second aspect is, can the person self-regulate their emotions and behaviours? We know that people who are mentally ill are sometimes not great at hiding how stressed they are or their anger or something of that nature. So self-regulation could be a second system. One system is the sort of integrated communication in amongst the parts of the brain. The second is about self-regulation. The third is, does the person see the world accurately? Now, when I say see the world accurately, I'm not talking in some philosophical kind of a way. This may actually be a visual disability. And I don't mean like the person has compromised sight in the way that would be the case if you had cataracts or something like that. But maybe what's going on is their actual ability to see things correctly is compromised by this P factor. Now, if that's the case, you think of the schizophrenic who is paranoiac and sees things as threats. Well, maybe actually they really look like threats if their visual capacity is compromised. So that could be system number 3. And then, does the person have executive function? So executive function is really the capacity of the brain to work together collaboratively to solve problems. So for instance, and it kind of relates a little bit back to the first component, can the brain talk amongst itself? But you'll notice that there are people who have really high IQs, but they don't seem to be able to get things done. And what's going on there is that maybe they just don't have the executive function to cause the parts of the brain, even if the parts of the brain are communicating with each other, maybe they're just not coordinating that well. And that's what executive function could be regarded at. Now, of course, what we're doing here is that we're moving away from symptoms and moving to systems. Now, if you've watched the video that I showed about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is a medical model, it says there are all these conditions, scads of them, and there are all these symptoms. Well, actually, maybe there are 4 systems that can be failing under these circumstances. So if you go to a therapist, maybe the therapist is going to do some sort of a diagnostic process, and maybe that could be a neurological scan or something like that, and say, well, the big problem you've got is a lack of coordination amongst the various components of your brain. Or maybe the issue is that you're just not seeing things correctly. Isn't that marvelously promising? If you could find a way of dealing with these things, then of course you may well be able to solve a range of mental illnesses. Because think of this. Think of all of the mental illnesses that you've ever heard of. Don't those 4 things explain a lot about how a person might behave under those circumstances? Now, if this is the case, then the DSM is out the window, because the old-fashioned medical model says, okay, all of these illnesses, all of these diagnoses, as though it's kind of like a broken toe or something like that. Imagine if we start diagnosing these 4 key systems. Now, I don't doubt that there'll be more systems identified, but these 4 are pretty promising. Another contemporary perspective on mental illness is the capacity to grow new brain cells, otherwise known as neurogenesis. So, some people seem to be able to continue to grow brain cells throughout their entire life. Others seem to have a compromised capacity to do this. Now, partially this is genetic, but some of the more contemporary treatments that we've seen, so you might have heard of things like microdosing of certain types of drugs, like even psychotropic drugs, and one of the things that we know is that sometimes you can measure the fact that these treatments have caused people to be able to grow more brain cells. What if mental illness in some people is simply a loss of the capacity to grow new brain cells? Your brain simply won't cope as well with the evolving world if you can't do that. The other thing that we know is that P correlates with G. Well, what do we mean by that? P is the psychopathology factor that we've been mentioning in this video. G is general mental ability, how smart somebody is. And what we know is that the smarter somebody is, the less likely they are to have this psychopathology factor. Now let's turn our attention to neurodiversity. So autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's syndrome, other things like that. So one of the things that we know is that people have been highly successful recruiting high-functioning people with autism spectrum disorder. The focus of a high-functioning ASD person can be really good at solving certain problems. And if that's the case, then work that other people might find difficult, tedious, or simply not be as good at, using a more neurologically diverse approach to the hiring can be really, really effective. Now, in the next video, we'll be talking about the relationship between psych testing and mental illness, and then we'll go on to some specifics like cognitive ability, personality, and values in mental illness. To join us, click on the link near this video.